Why is it some people in certain parts of Connecticut have a better chance of living to 90 than someone who lives in a different neighborhood where he or she may not make it to even 70? With us today from Connecticut Magazine, Eric Ofgang, who did some interesting reporting on the disparity. How long will you live? In this month's Connecticut Magazine. Eric, good to see you here in the program.
Thank you for having me.
So I was kind of surprised that there's almost a 20-year swing between some neighborhoods in Connecticut and some other more fortunate neighborhoods. What's the healthiest neighborhood in Connecticut in terms of living the longest?
So there's a neighborhood in Westport, where the life expectancy is 89 years, and that is more than 20 years longer than what is the lowest life expectancy neighborhood in Connecticut in Hartford, which is 68 years.
That was the north end of Hartford. I know, yeah. 68 years in the north end of Hartford. And the average is 80 across the state, correct?
Yes, yeah.
What was the most surprising thing you learned as you went through all these numbers in the different towns?
Well, I think when we first started looking at it and in our discussions about it, we all kind of assumed that, in the city you might live less time, or in poor neighborhoods you might live less than in wealthy neighborhoods. But what was really surprising was just how quick it could change. So, where I live in Bethel, Connecticut, if you look at my address, the life expectancy is 78 years. But as you go down the road less than a mile, it jumps to well over 80. And then it can go down depending on where you go. And in some of the cities you have, as much as a 13-year gap between neighborhoods within the same city.
Yeah, I noticed when you looked at the town of Avon, which scored high overall, some of the neighborhoods were 7 years difference between one part of Avon and the other part of town. What are some of the factors that might go into that discrepancy, that disparity?
Well, it's really hard to say when you start to get to longer lived neighborhoods, and experts really aren't sure. There are things, it could be more opportunities for walking, more subtle encouragements to exercise. If you see a lot of people out running, maybe that encourages you to go out and run yourself. Maybe there's more elements within the landscape that make something like exercise more likely to happen. When you start looking at the bigger, someplace that's under 70 versus 80, there are a lot of things such as economics, access to health care, just all around the neighborhoods aren't conducive to being outside. People who live there tend to have a lot more stress for a variety of reasons.
How did the state compare regionally, like county by county? Were there some areas where the numbers were significantly higher?
No, county by county, it all was pretty similar, all within about a year or so. And the state as a whole does pretty well. And that's why this kind of study is interesting, because, Connecticut as a whole is on the higher level of states in the, it's one of the top 5 or so. And so we do pretty well. But when you get down to those individual neighborhoods, that's where you start to really see that disparity between where, maybe living here and living someplace else is different.
And I think it was Bridgeport that had a neighborhood where it was relatively high, but there was another one that was kind of on the low side.
Yeah, and it was in that one they had the census tract was for the street. So basically you cross to one side of the street and it goes down, as much as 6 years, the life expectancy. And what was very fascinating to me was when I was talking to people who study this type of way that place might influence life expectancy, is what they say is that it really isn't always about, the health decisions you or I make, but it's about, where we live. So it's your address can mean as much as a decision to, have a French fry or a vegetable.
How do socioeconomic factors fit into this? The wealthier towns seem to score higher.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge correlation, obviously, between the wealthier towns and longevity, and that seems, there are variations even within wealthy towns. A neighborhood in Westport has a life expectancy that's a few years higher than other neighborhoods in Westport, but it does. Economics are obviously playing a big role in this. I think, just access to health care, access to healthy lifestyles, decreased stress.
And so parks play a role as well, you're saying?
Yeah. The way one person I spoke with for the article put it is, if you live in a neighborhood that has a park, you have the option of exercising. So you have a choice whether to exercise or not, or a choice whether to go for a walk. If you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have a park, that choice, you don't necessarily have that choice.
How did gender break down in this? Because I know I believe you wrote that, because women live longer than men, their life expectancy is longer than you and I will have, and some neighborhoods might have more women in them, so it could skew the numbers.
And that's something that we weren't able to really piece out in my research and the research that I was using for this, but it could be a factor. So if there was more women in one neighborhood, that might increase the longevity in a certain neighborhood.
At the end of the day, do you think it will be a factor as people go to buy houses? They're moving to Connecticut and let's say, I want to live a long life, so I'm not going to live here, but I will live here.
I don't know. You know, it's hard to say because usually, you know, if you're looking at a place in West Hartford, the disparities between two neighborhoods in West Hartford might not be that big that it's gonna sway you. It was funny that, you know, as I was working on the story, I ended up moving, and it was, you know, I think I lost about 4 years in the exchange, and I was like, oh no. But you know, there also are other factors. So obviously, it's not just a vacuum. It's based on, you know, who chooses to live in neighborhoods, who ends up living in these neighborhoods. So there, you know, there are factors other than geography in health, of course.
In terms of walkable areas, does that play a factor at all?
It seems to. You know, I think, you know, being able to walk more, having nice places to go outside, having, you know, a sense of community all seem to play a role. It's not clear exactly what role.
And what about living near factories and things like that in urban areas?
Yeah, so you know, there is the possibility with these studies that some of the areas with low life expectancy is caused by some type of environmental factor and some type of environmental contamination. You'd have to really test for that on the individual level, but that could potentially play a role.
And there are some who dismiss it altogether and just say these are just numbers and it makes no difference.
Yeah, you know, and there are questions. You know, when you get down to the smaller level, yes, it tells you more about things, but it's also more. There's also more room for variation and more. You know, if you move the census tract line 2 blocks over, does that change the numbers and questions of that nature?
And how does our state compare to others?
We do pretty well. Where you know, these are the disparity isn't something that is unique to Connecticut. It's happening across the country in neighborhoods, cities, towns. But on a whole, Connecticut is one of the more has a better life expectancy than most other states.
So it's 80 is the life expectancy for most people in Connecticut. And to summarize, Westport, the healthiest. Hartford's North End has the lowest right now. It's 68.
Yes, yeah.
Fascinating figures. Eric Ofgame, we enjoyed reading this article, and I recommend people to go through the numbers. And it's good that we have people who like to do that. Also, you are the author of the new book, The Good Vices, From Beer to Sex, The Surprising Truth About What's Actually Good for You. Fascinating read, perhaps not for Face Estate, but for something. We appreciate you dropping it off. All right. Eric Ofgame, thank you very much from Connecticut Magazine today. And we thank you so much for watching Face Estate on this Sunday. Our next news is tonight, and coming up right after Face Estate, Connecticut's own Jane Pauley with CBS Sunday Morning. Have a great Sunday, everybody. I'll see you back here tomorrow on the news.